Hey, welcome back to Ruck the Way. Chris, good to see you this morning.
Gabe, good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, we never talk about what time of the day we're recording these things, but it is like 7 a.m. here in Charlotte, Matthews, North Carolina, where I am. And Chris, where are you in East Lothian? What time is it?
East Lothian, it is now a little bit after 12 noon. So, yeah, I'm 5 hours ahead of Gabe. So, I have the privilege of being awake and have had several cups of coffee before Gabe actually has his first.
Yeah, so if it seems like Chris is more with it, I mean, he might actually be in general, but also he's got 5 hours on me by the time we do these things.
Indeed.
Well,
It hardly seems fair, Gabe, but I appreciate the timing on this.
yeah, no problem. Well, today we've got a great topic, something that has really been significant for both of us in our journey, and that's the subject of vulnerability, which is something I think is being talked about more now, maybe than ever before, but it also is something I think that particularly men might be afraid of.
Yeah, and I guess we should say right here at the onset is that we are both dudes. So, we are going to be speaking today about vulnerability from a masculine perspective. And also the pilgrimages that we have been on or have led have been at this point only with men. So we've had the real chance to experience how men wrestle with vulnerability, what that looks like, and what they struggle with. And so that's not to say that women don't struggle with vulnerability. I think they may struggle differently, but really what we can bring our expertise, if you want to call it that, is to vulnerability and men and how men approach that whole topic of being vulnerable with each other.
Yeah, and I would just say for our female listeners out there, um, as we're talking about it from the male perspective, I would just invite you to see this as understanding this subject from the male perspective, and for those men in your life, this could help you understand more of this particular struggle for them.
Hmm.
So, Chris, when we think about vulnerability, I think this is one of those 10-cent words that it's a it's a big word,
Yeah.
but I think we need to unpack, like, what does it really mean,
What does it
before we
mean?
get into the
Yeah.
nuances of, like, how does it work and what are the particular struggles with it. Um, what do you like? Let's go to imagery first. Like, when you think of uh, vulnerability, what image comes to mind for you?
Well, really, there's two things that come to mind as we were talking about vulnerability earlier and kind of prepping for today. I was thinking, well, the word vulnerability itself comes from Latin. And, my high school Latin is failing me right now, but I think it's vulnare, which means to wound. So for you Latin scholars out there, don't check me on that one, but I'm pretty sure that it does mean it's a word that means to wound. So to be vulnerable is to be woundable. So the first image is, basically, you think in the Roman context, it was like a knife wound or a wound
Mhm.
from a sword in battle. That's what it
Yeah,
meant to be vulnerable. So to be stabbed.
right.
So it's
Yeah.
an image of pain.
So to be open to wounding. Um,
Yes.
so maybe as you're saying that, the image that's popping in my mind is like taking off your armor,
Yeah.
like the act of taking off your armor and standing before someone who is wielding a weapon.
Yeah. In a sense, it's the image of getting naked in front of someone. I mean,
Oh boy.
figuratively speaking, you're taking off your
Yeah,
armor, you're
right.
taking off the things that would normally protect you, and it feels very counterintuitive and
Hmm.
dangerous. I have another good one, and this comes from a buddy of mine, Drew Boa, who I hope to get on the podcast at some point in the future. But he talks about the difference between transparency and
Mm,
vulnerability. And I think that's a good kind of definition point as well, because I think they're very different. They're similar,
mm.
but different.
I was just gonna say, on the surface, they sound like very, like,
Right.
oh yeah, that's kind of the same thing. But anyway,
Yeah.
go
If
ahead.
we ask you to be transparent, we say, oh, well, yeah, that's vulnerability. Well, maybe, maybe not. So the image he uses is transparency is like going to the zoo and being at the gorilla enclosure, but having a really thick piece of glass between you and the gorillas.
Mm.
There's transparency there. You can see the gorillas can see you, but you know that there's a level of protection between you.
Mm.
Vulnerability
Yeah.
is taking away the glass barrier and standing
Wow.
there and being woundable. The gorilla
Hmm.
can get to you, and I guess you can get to the gorilla too, but that's probably not the worry.
The gorilla's not worried about that.
The gorilla
I
is
don't know
not worried about
if
you.
in this, but all metaphors break down. And in this one, I have to say that if we're moving the 3-inch plexiglass from between you and a gorilla, I just think that's stupidity.
Right. Well,
uh,
hey, but that's a good point, Gabe, and I think that's how most men feel about vulnerability. It's like, why in the world would you ever remove that plexiglass? Isn't it good enough to be transparent? I mean, you get to see the gorilla gets to see you, you're safe.
mhm.
Yeah, the metaphor does break down, but
Well, I just mean with gorillas in particular.
with this could be like a wildlife podcast. We could just go on from
Yeah,
here, but
that's right. No, but I think that's, man, it's such a powerful point that you're making because that's right. I think culturally, we value transparency. Like that is the value. Like, oh yeah, like I'm letting you see what's going on behind the curtain here, so to speak. And we see each other, and isn't that enough that like we see each other? But it's not enough if what we're like longing for, what the ultimate outcome is
mm,
connection, right? Which
yes.
is that's if we say like, well, why vulnerability? Like why remove the glass? Why take off the armor? And expose yourself to the possibility of being hurt. Like the point is to be connected. And so if that's the point, then transparency isn't in fact enough. If we leave it at transparency, Chris, what where does that take us? Like if all we do is like, hey, I see you, you see me, and we can agree like that doesn't ultimately lead to the kind of connection that we're longing for. Um,
Yeah.
where does it take us?
Well, I think we talked about this in a previous podcast, Gabe, where we were mentioning the kind of masks that we all tend to wear. Not tend to wear, we
Mhm,
all wear.
mhm.
A lot of those masks come from experiences in our past, in our childhood, our wounding trauma. I mean, all that stuff
Yeah.
helps to create the masks that we wear. And we said that when you wear a mask, um, only the mask receives love.
Mhm,
So no one ever gets to see your real face behind that mask. And so only the
mhm,
mask can actually receive the connection that you were talking about that we all long for. So it's the risk of taking off the mask, which is the vulnerable part, so that your real face can be seen and that you can receive connection and love. And I think that we all long for that, but it terrifies us at the same time. And again, for men, especially, I think in our culture, we're taught that we need to wear certain masks of strength, of invulnerability rather than vulnerability,
mhm,
that we need to come through, that we need to provide, that we need to kind of scale the ladder of success and conquer. And vulnerability and taking off the mask feels like the opposite of all of those things that our culture
mhm.
says that men should do or be.
If all we're being is transparent, then like we're really just showing people a version of ourselves that we think is acceptable to them, but we're the ones deciding like this is what I think could be. It's not the real me, but I'm going to
Right.
let you see a version of me that I think will be acceptable enough. Um,
Yeah.
and like that's our version of, so even in transparency, we're not really being transparent because we're really part of being behind the glasses. I'm still in control of what
Yes.
you're seeing.
Yeah. You can see, like you said, like a facsimile or a version of the true me, but
Yeah.
it only goes so far. Like here's the glass. and
Mhm.
you're not going to get close enough. You might be able to see some things that are true about me, but you can't ever get beyond that glass, because if you do, that's where I risk being hurt by you.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, and I think we all feel that, right, Gabe? If you
Mhm.
knew the true me, if you knew all of my story, all of my struggles, would you stay?
Mhm. Right. That's the question.
Well, that's the
That's the question
question.
we're all asking.
Yeah.
And I think back to the beginning, I think that's a human, like, this isn't so far, like, this isn't a man thing.
Right.
This is a human problem. Part of the human condition is that, like, we struggle to be real, with each other, I think. Um, let's get specific for a second for those that might be like haven't maybe explored this topic in depth, because so we're saying to be vulnerable is to be open to wounding. um the image is kind of like you're taking off your armor, you're taking off a mask, you're taking off things that are protecting you and
Hmm.
allowing yourself to truly be seen. um and and then that's a really scary thing. And Chris, what I hear you saying is part of what's scary is like is we're asking the question, am I acceptable? Um, and for most of us, I think that the answer to that is, at least in part, no. I
No.
don't really think I'm acceptable. So I'm curious, just to dive in more specifically, what does some of the armor, some of the mask, like what does that look like? What have you seen that look like for others? What does that look like for you? I mean, I think we can both talk about
Yeah.
that,
Both chime in there.
just to put some language to, what are these things that we cover ourselves with, um, so that we don't get hurt.
Yeah. And some of these we've already mentioned. And again, I'm going to be speaking from my experience as a man. I think some of those masks that we learn to put on are, yeah, I'm just thinking back to adolescence, kind of that middle school period where you're first learning about what's going to keep you safe and what's going to get you hurt. You learn very quickly where to slot into this kind of hierarchy of um, social acceptance in the world.
Mhm.
What allows you to look cool and what doesn't. And that may be image based, what you wear, how you style your hair, what music you listen to. It's basically, do I fit into the group?
Yeah.
And I think for men, it's like, do I fit into the group of other boys or other men?
Yeah.
What sports do you play? How well do you play them? Are you the first picked or the last picked in the PE class as teams are split up? I
Yeah.
mean, I think these are the places that boys tend to measure themselves very quickly and earlier on. I mean, am I physically strong enough to be able to take the other guy if I'm ever
Mhm.
threatened? Um,
Mhm.
or do I learn to be the funny guy in class so that I'm never actually physically threatened because I'm the jester who can make the cool kids laugh.
Mhm.
I mean, that was part of my story. I think I was funny enough that I could find my own space kind of in these different spheres of, the different cliques that exist in the world of adolescence. So I could kind of move in between each one's. But I mean, behind that kind of funny exterior, it was that always calculating, how do I keep myself safe here? How do I
Yeah.
fit in? How do I see, how do I project an image that allows me to be okay and not be
Mhm.
wounded?
Mhm. Yeah,
So
it's
those are some
interesting
things
how
I
that.
think of. How about you? Where did you find yourself in that, Gabe?
Well, before I jump into me, I just was thinking, it's interesting that I do think this sort of, we sort of choose our armor, so to speak,
Yes.
during adolescence. It's just kind of an interesting thing as we think about, like, our stories, that, like, I think it's something that we all have in common, is that, like, that's a period of life where, let's face it, it's not a safe period of life. I think back to, probably one of the worst years of my life was 7th grade at Quail Hall
Huh.
Middle School. and I won't go into it. It's too early in the morning to get into that trauma, but I think back on that place and I think that was not a safe space. I mean, it wasn't a physically safe space
Right.
for me and for a lot of other kids who were bullied and, physically threatened and things like that. Um, but it for sure, I think was not, and I doubt many people would say middle school was a psychologically, emotionally, mentally safe space, right? Like it was a very
Yes.
dangerous place where, you're trying to find your identity, but there's a lot of like threats to your identity, to your point. Um, because it's a very difficult time to try to like fit in because kids are mean,
Kids are mean.
Yeah. So, and I remember watching my own daughter go through those years and how cruel and difficult people were in that time. So anyway, so it makes all that to say like it makes sense because I think there can be
Mhm.
this idea that like, oh, we put on armor and we don't want to be vulnerable and that's bad. Well, there's a
Right.
reason why we do it. And there's a necessity to like we have to have something, in those
It's called
years.
survival.
Right. We do it
Yeah.
to survive, right? And so you put on that mask of that veneer of like being funny to protect yourself. Um, because really taking those questions of like, am I enough to a bunch of 13-year-old boys is a terrible idea.
That is a terrible
So,
idea. That's like getting into the gorilla enclosure and just kinda hanging out with the gorillas. Yeah. No, and I
right.
think that's a really good point, Gabe. It's that we're not saying that we should all be 100% vulnerable at all times with everyone because we live in a real world
Hmm.
where we as humans instinctively know that that's not safe. So, I mean, we can maybe talk about that a little bit later is how do you find safe places for vulnerability
Right.
and with whom are you vulnerable?
Right.
So,
Yes.
because I think that's a big question.
Right.
'Cause it's not with everyone. That really would be foolishness.
Yeah, I think that's maybe after I share a little bit of my story, we could dive into, I always call it just appropriate vulnerability,
Yes.
that there's appropriate vulnerability. But the key is that I think it through the lens of story, like we have this period in our life where we find armor, we find masks that allow us to survive and it works to an extent, but it cost us something too.
Yes, that's so true.
And so while it does maybe protect us in a season, the cost is tremendous, and the cost is connection. The cost is being known. You know, um, the cost is that we never get those questions answered, and that we enter
Yeah.
adulthood still asking, "Am I enough?"
Mhm.
And you and I both are professional coaches when we're not doing this sort of thing, and when you coach business leaders, like I've never coached a business leader that didn't at some level struggle with like imposter syndrome,
Sure.
which is exactly what we're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
the imposter syndrome is a fear of being found out for not being enough because there's a belief that like I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't really have what
Yeah.
it takes. And I'm wearing this mask around. Um, and and I'm just terrified that I'm gonna really be seen, and
Yeah.
so when we carry those things and then we have nowhere to be real, the cost is we're not connected, we're isolated, we're alone. Um,
Loneliness.
yeah, which is a
Yeah.
epidemic, I think,
Epidemic.
you
Epidemic
know?
among people, but I think in a very particular way with men
Yes,
because it's so easy to hide behind that mask that you just mentioned. And it's not
that's right.
just men who are in business. I mean, I do most of my coaching within the kind of Christian professional ministry world, and it's the
Yeah,
exact same story there.
yes,
Men who are involved in ministry are asking those same questions and living with those same fears. Am I enough? I feel like an imposter.
Yes.
I'm just faking it till I make it.
Right.
And the real cost is at the end of the day, they are some of the loneliest people. And you would expect that people sort of in the world of Christian ministry, that they would have that kind of religious connection with others. I have not found that to be the case.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think it leads to extreme loneliness.
Well, yeah, we can. I feel like that's a whole episode on
That's an episode
like
of its
the
own.
religious persona. And
Right.
that's of course an ultimate mask, that we wear, and that's a subculture that can be very destructive in its own way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I think for me, to go back to your question, what are some of my masks? There are many. I have many masks, Chris.
Let's be vulnerable, Gabe. That's what we're doing,
Let's be
right?
vulnerable. Yeah, I'll do appropriate vulnerability for the podcast
Yes.
here.
It's good.
There was I went through, as we both did, a process with some dear mentors and friends. Gosh, this has been nearly 10 years ago now, which was the first time I was really exposed to this idea that I have a story and I have a mask. Um,
Yeah.
and those are two new concepts for me. And I think part of the reason we wanted to talk about this today is that for those listeners who've never heard of like those two things, which is like you have a story. And we meet
Mhm.
so many people who say, I don't really have a story. What they mean is I don't have an interesting story or I don't have a
Right.
story that I've
A
actually
trauma
thought
story.
about,
Yeah.
right? A trauma, some traumatic thing. But the reality is we all have deep story. The reality is we all have a trauma story. We just
Yes.
haven't thought carefully enough about it, and we haven't had reverence for our own story. And so,
Mm.
if somebody's listening and has
Can
never
you
thought about that,
can I just interrupt you right
yeah,
there? Say more
sure,
about that, about having reverence. That strikes me as really important. What do you mean when you say having reverence for your story?
yeah. Well, I remember somebody. I think maybe it was Dan Allender, who's one of our heroes of the faith. I've only met him once, but I would consider him, one of those mentors, mostly through his
Mhm.
writing. But I think he says every time that somebody shares their story, you should take your shoes off because you're walking on
Yeah.
holy ground. And I just
Wow.
always thought,
Yeah.
what a beautiful image, of because story is the space where God is at work. Um,
Yes.
Story
Love
is the
that.
space where God is the one ultimately writing a narrative of a person's life. Um, and man, there's just something so beautiful about thinking of it in that way. Um, that life isn't just happening by an accident or something. Your life isn't happening um, purely as a result of only your actions and
Yes.
the things you choose, but you know there is indeed a God who's writing a story and inviting you to actually go back to our theme here, to know Him, um,
Mm.
to see Him and to be seen by Him, to be connected to the one who made you, and that's um, and so where is that work happening? That's the question. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's the space of our story. It's in the
And
events of your life.
it's so good, Gabe, that you mentioned that, just about sort of those moments, the threads of holiness that go through our story, where the God of the universe is actually walking in those places. And I do think that we tend to be afraid of the dark places. And that's where we feel most alone, feel most of the shame,
Yeah.
the places where we certainly do not want to be vulnerable about. But what I hear you saying is that those are the moments where God is actually walking in those spaces too. And the
Yeah.
invitation is to actually go into story to find where God was at work there. And, if we can go to those places with Jesus and find him there,
Hmm. For sure.
what would it be like to then risk exposing some of those things with trusted others? Jesus has already been there. If the
Right.
God of the universe has already been there, can we trust those spaces with others?
Yes.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
And
love that.
yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, just to get theological for a second, because it is such a beautiful story. And I think this idea that, our stories are rooted, are placed in a larger story is so important. And this is, I think, the significance of belief, in a story that can contain your story. And it's why it's humanism and sort of postmodern theory that you just invent your own meta narrative, um, that you invent the context for your story, that you invent the truth is evil. And I don't
Yeah.
use that word lightly. And I use evil in the way of like it's destructive and that it leads to
Hmm.
death, it leads to undoing, it leads to everything that isn't good in the world. But there's a beautiful story. And I think, in the beginning of the true story of the world, that we find in the poetic account of Genesis, that is the account of really relationship between God and human beings and speaks to the nature of that relationship, the story of Adam and Eve in paradise in a garden. And then when they reject God, they reject his place at the tree, and um they choose themselves, they choose freedom over connection with God, and sin enters into the picture, and through that rebellion, then there's this brokenness that happens. And I think it's such profound imagery that the first thing they do, it says they realize they're naked. I mean, and this is just
Hmm.
right where we're talking about today, right? Is they realize they're vulnerable. They realize they have no armor and they need it. And that in itself is it was the first time the people realized like, "Oh my gosh, I don't have anything covering me. I don't have anything protecting me, and I need protection."
They feel
Because
shame.
and then it says they were afraid and they were ashamed.
Yes.
And
Shamed.
so
Yeah.
fear and shame enter the picture. And to your point, that these are emotions that are at the low end of the energy scale for
Hmm.
human beings, right? Like it's when we're operating out of shame and fear, um, we're operating in a diminished way. But I think so many of us, especially men, are operating in fear and shame. And masquerading as other things. And that's what we're talking about. Like, how do we but we feel exposed. And in that beginning story, you know, the next thing is they went and hid. They hid from
Yeah.
God. And, and Dan Allender says, like we've been hiding ever since.
Ever
Um,
since.
and so that's the dynamic that's
Yeah.
going on in this bigger
Mm.
narrative is that this is the human condition is that we're naked, we're fearful, we're ashamed, and we're hiding from the one whose connection is ultimately meant to give us life and meaning and purpose and all those things.
Yes.
And we're just running around through our life trying to find connection, trying to find worth, trying to find significance, all the while
And
covering
carrying all the
ourselves,
fear and shame. Yes.
carrying it all. So that's the dynamic, I think. And so this idea that we are um, walking on holy ground when we're walking in story, this bigger story, right? That like is told because the bigger story of the scriptures doesn't end there. The story is a
Right.
story of being found. I mean, it's a
Yes.
story of hiding and then being found and being chased, um, by God's goodness and mercy and kindness. Um,
And in the
and
Christian
you,
story, it's the story of God actually choosing to risk taking on
mm,
human flesh. Jesus,
right.
the God
Yeah.
man who becomes ultimately vulnerable to his own creation. I mean, talking about a risk and vulnerability where all of the plexiglass is removed. Jesus becomes the one who suffers at the hands of his creation, suffers death, and then is resurrected and then is able to offer us not only new life and salvation the way that we talk about in church, but I think to our point here, it gives us the opportunity to then find Jesus in those dark places in our story and have those bits redeemed as well. So I think as Christians, we've looked at salvation in such a shallow way. It's just kind of
Yeah.
the intellectual assent of, yes, I say yes to Jesus as my savior. I believe that he is the
Mhm.
Son of God. But I think that the power of the gospel actually goes so much deeper when we take the risk to let him into those deeper, darker places where we do feel our greatest shame, where we
Right.
feel our greatest fears, and have
Yes.
him meet us there. And
Right.
then when he meets us there, then we, I think, are able to risk more vulnerability with other humans.
Right. Yes, because when we meet the Lord, and receive and reveal, I mean, he already knows, but when we choose to reveal all of our, because you're right, Chris, I think we've reduced the good news for those listening that may not know what the gospel is. It just means the good news. It's
Mm,
like, but we've sort of reduced that to a truth proposition or something like that, to a prayer that someone prays. And what it's really about is relationship, and it's about being known, and it's about being exposed. It's about
yeah,
like saying, "Hey, here's my," to your point, the darkest things about me, um, the things I'm least proud of in my story, and like being willing to drop our guard, to the Lord, and then receiving His kindness instead of His
yeah,
judgment, and man, and that is what brings healing, but that work really happens in the space of trusted relationship with others who are walking the way. Um,
yes. So
so yeah.
let's talk about that for a minute, Gabe, because I think that's an
Mhm.
important point. Because I do think in the West, and when we're talking about kind of the Christian story, it may be easy for us to let God into those places. So I'm thinking even in this kind of Western individualistic context where, it's me and God, we do our thing. He forgives me of my sin. I allow him to go into dark places. But where it gets really tricky and really hard is then to take that next step that you just mentioned, which is to actually be in community with others, where we risk other human beings that we can look in the eye, who can look at us and reveal things about ourselves that we don't like, that
Yeah,
bring us shame. That's super hard.
man.
What what do you
Yeah.
think? I know you have a great illustration that I've heard you use before about a deck of cards,
Uh, the
and
cards.
vulnerability. The cards. Can you share
Yes.
that with us? And then maybe we can talk a little
Yeah.
bit about what is it like to be vulnerable, and how do we determine who's safe to be vulnerable with?
Well, because, let's going back to the first kind of part of our conversation, that, the world is truly not a safe place.
Mhm.
We learned this in 7th grade, or at least for
Yes.
me, or before that. But certainly, that's true. And yet, like, we're made for connection. We're made to be together, and we're made to find healing in the context of community, but it has to be a particular kind of community. And I think, the safe places have to be with people who, uh, have themselves received the grace and kindness of God, and know who they are, and have a fixed point of identity. Um, and so there's safe and unsafe people. Let's just
Oh,
say that. And I think, safe people, and the older I've gotten and the more I process my story, I've found safe people to be the only safe people are vulnerable people. Safe people are people who are willing to and have, um, allowed themselves to be seen in their darker spaces, and then have received and understood the good news,
yeah.
and received that healing. but are still walking as wounded people. And so, anyway, the analogy that you're referring to is something that a counselor told me an important part of my life is that, imagine that like we're all holding a deck of cards. And so we're sitting across from each other holding a deck of cards. And when it comes to vulnerability, we're choosing how many cards to lay down before other people. And you don't owe anybody all your cards except
Yeah.
for your spouse. Honestly, like your spouse should see all of your cards, should know everything about you. Um, and probably your therapist. If you're hiding cards from your therapist, probably not letting them do their job.
You're wasting your
Um,
money. Yeah.
you're wasting your money.
Yeah.
Um, but like with everybody else, like I think we're making judicious decisions about how many cards to lay down. And I think I've loved that analogy because I think for me, it gives permission to have appropriate vulnerability.
Mhm.
Um, is that people are different degrees of safe. And I think in Western culture, especially in American culture, we're very binary. It's black and
Yeah.
white, it's Republican or Democrat, it's this or that. Um, and the reality is the world and life is not binary by and large. It's gray.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this idea that there's different degrees of safety with people. Um, and that like people earn our trust.
Mhm.
And they earn the first way they earn our trust when it comes to vulnerability is they're vulnerable. Like, and
Right.
so what I would tell you is somebody who's not vulnerable, who you just experience, and we all know what this feels like is, this is just a person that's pretending. Like they're pretending to
Yes.
be religious, they're pretending to be good, they're pretending. And I think a sign of pretending is that when you're living a very simple story, like,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, that I have this facade, this persona that I'm projecting to the world, and it's a very simple one, and it can't contain very much nuance. It can't contain a real human, and I think, man, if somebody's pretending, they're not gonna get many of my cards. That's what I would
Yeah.
tell you, because, like, that's not a trustworthy person, because that what that tells me is this is a person who has not process their own story, who isn't yet ready to receive something difficult. And that's a person that's probably likely to respond to anything deep that I might share with judgment.
Yes.
Um, and that's a real threat.
Mhm.
But we all need some safe space to be able to lay down our cards. So I'm saying, all of those with your spouse, all those um, with your counselor, but I think for men, like we need at least one brother,
Yeah.
who we
Yeah.
can, and Chris, just to say it out loud, like Chris is that for me, Chris is
Mm.
my brother that, um, I think I've laid down most of my cards with you, Chris. I can't think of any. I
Well,
haven't.
eh
If I haven't laid down cards, it's not been intentional. But I think it's just to say it's a super rare thing to
no, it
find.
is. Right.
Yeah,
And that's important, Gabe, and I think it's okay for us to name that it's rare,
yeah,
to name that you don't have to lay down all of your cards with everyone. It's rare, but it is necessary and worth seeking out,
hmm
and that
yes.
to do that is going to take risk. But I love what you were just saying, kind of how your rubric of determining who's okay to lay your cards down with. If they're vulnerable, if they risk vulnerability with you, then that says something about who they are
Yeah.
and what they can hold. And probably they've already gone through that process themselves of saying how much do I risk? And I do think that you and I have both found that as we risk vulnerability with each other, what that does is it builds something that is rare and it is powerful, that lets us both know that we're not alone. We
Right.
talked a lot about loneliness, and loneliness just kills. that isolation,
Oh,
the
it
fear, the
does.
shame, it just kills you. And you can keep trying to put the mask back on, but underneath, I think you and I would both agree that you're just dying inside. And it isn't until you risk that vulnerability and share some of these deeper, darker things that you hate or that you're ashamed of, and you have someone who reacts with kindness and compassion who goes, "Really? That's all you got?
Yeah.
I That's okay with me. I'm
Right.
not gonna reject you. I
Yeah.
can hold your deepest shame
Yeah.
as much as a human can,
Right.
and I still love you." What that brings is such relief. You're like,
Mhm.
"Oh,
Yeah.
these things that I was so scared of actually revealing are being held by someone else, and they're not turning tail, running away." Um, that's just life. That's just it brings life and health, and you can go, "Oh,
Yeah. Somebody saw me for who I really am and didn't turn away.
yeah."
You know, um, no, it is what we long for. It is so rare. Um, and then this is getting at the crux of like what we wanted to talk about today is like why vulnerability is so scary. Um,
Mhm.
because like people do have weapons.
Yeah.
Um, and it really isn't safe. And yet, the the life that we're longing for, the life of being known, the life of being truly loved, the life of being seen in all our dirtiness and yet still embraced, um, is only possible when we're vulnerable, when we expose ourselves to wounding. But we have to do that with the right people. And I think
With the right
one
people.
of the things is like becoming the right person for others. Like,
Yeah.
sort of one of those things you teach your kids, like if you want to have a great friend, like be a great friend,
Be a
you
friend.
know,
If you want a friend, be a friend.
right?
Yes.
If you want to receive grace and kindness, you know, when you're vulnerable, like be the kind of person, become the kind of person um, that knows how to be vulnerable and
Right.
hold that for others. And the way we do that is, I think, doing the work to process our own stories. Going way back, you asked me, you shared a bit of your mask. An aspect of I actually named my mask, but back in the day, so I'll share the name that I gave my mask, um, which is Captain Smiley Lonesome, is
Mm,
the name of my mask, and, it was part of my story was, I was a military officer. Rank of captain was my highest rank that I achieved, but the captain to me is the Gabe who has it all together, who's totally in charge, who like if there's a problem, I'll figure it out, I'll solve it, I'll be totally responsible for everybody and everything. Um, and it was a mask that served me really well, in the military until it didn't serve me well in
yeah.
life because nobody has it all together. Nobody can be totally responsible. Um, Smiley is like that. There's an aspect of my personality that is, just happy. Like, and I like, and that's not untrue. But when I learned to wear that as a mask, I learned that people liked that. And
Yeah.
so even when I was devastated inside, going back to your story of middle school, that was you were the comedian and I was just the happy, responsible kid, who always did the right thing and who was always happy and like it didn't matter like whatever was going on. I just, showed a face that said there's nothing going on here, nothing to worry about here, keep moving. Um and what that last word, lonesome, is that, when you cover yourself with a mask of responsibility and happiness, like what that leads to is ultimate loneliness. Is that
Yes.
because you can't because there was no space for anything difficult or dark or any of those things. Like I could only be the responsible, happy person, but I was the lonely person underneath all of that. Um, and the cost of that, just like the cost of all mask, is the cost of connection.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, man. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that because I know that's vulnerable to even share that name with the world of podcasting. Um, and
Yeah.
I guess I just want to say this, and you alluded to this earlier. I want to bless that mask
Mm,
because it helped you to survive.
it
And I
did.
think that's
Yeah.
what I want people to know too, is that we're not wanting to have contempt for the ways that we learned to survive in the world. Those things actually were very helpful. Even some of the things that we hate, the choices that we've made,
Yeah.
those things actually helped us to survive. And they bring us to a certain place, I think, in life where we can hopefully come and be curious enough about them to say, you know what? I bless the fact, Gabe, that you were Captain Smiley Lonesome. It allowed you to survive. I want to bless my mask of being the friendly, funny, guy that can kind of move between worlds. It helped me to survive. And at a certain point, when we are wanting to step into vulnerability to remove those masks, we don't want to, with contempt, just say, you know what? Oh, I hate who I was in middle school. I hate that kid. Why did he always have to do this and this and this? No, I want to bless that boy. I want to bless
Yes.
his masks. And I want to say, it's okay. I'm actually an adult now. It's okay for you to have made the choices that you made. I want to be able to bless you, bless the mask, and then with vulnerability to move forward and to say, okay, what choices do I want to make now as a man to have real connection?
Right. Well, that's the thing, right? For guys, real friendship,
Yeah,
it's
so hard.
elusive, so hard.
So
I think
hard.
most guys don't have any real friends. Um, they have people you know, have certain activities they go do with, people they work with, people they play golf with, they shoot guns with,
Yeah.
but to really be known to somebody who like knows your, has seen most of your cards and still sticks around, um, is such a rare thing, and yet that's like what we're all about. It's
Yeah.
like, and that's what Ruck the Way is about, and that's what like going creating these spaces to go and walk. What is that really about? Um, it's creating a context for people, for men in particular, to tell their stories um, in a space that where they won't be judged, in a space
Yeah.
where that can be modeled and as well, and where real connection can happen.
And it's the opportunity that we want to give to allow people to take small risks in an environment of adventure and play and connection where you can start revealing a little bit more of your story and hopefully have it met with love and curiosity and compassion. And maybe other people in the group saying, you know what, me too. I've also been in that space. And then in that context, over the course of, say, 6 days of walking together, you at the end find I am with true brothers in the context of men, um, who have understood parts of my story that maybe I've never risked before. And in being vulnerable with them and risking vulnerability, vulnerability has been created in the group.
Mhm.
And at the end, you realize, oh, wow, maybe there's a different way to live and a different way to be. And maybe I can offer vulnerability in a safe context when I go back home to my normal world
Yeah.
to find connection and life.
Yes. Yeah, because vulnerability does beget vulnerability, right?
It does.
Like that's yeah. So if somebody's listening and they're not yet signed up for a podcast, or I'm sorry, a podcast, it's too early. You can't sign
You
up
want to
for
be
a
a guest on the
podcast.
podcast? Yeah.
Yeah, no, if they haven't signed up for a pilgrimage, uh, but they're listening to this and going, "Man, I think that's right. I think I do need to find a place to lay down some cards." And like, what would you recommend as just like a first step? Like, how do you begin going about this work of like, yeah, I know I'm hiding. I know I'm wearing a mask of somebody who has it all together, who's got it figured out. I'm covering with, my money. I'm covering with my title, my reputation, whatever that mask looks like. How does somebody begin that work today as they're listening to this?
Yeah, well, I think the very first steps are just to recognize maybe that you're wearing a mask,
Uh-huh.
um, and to recognize maybe the loneliness that you feel inside. Maybe to ask the question, do I want to live with this loneliness for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
It's asking the question, what am I willing to risk to find connection and to be seen?
Yeah.
I think that's the basic step is what do you desire? Are you
Yeah.
desiring something different for your life?
Yes.
And then I think there's all sorts of avenues that you can go. I mean, you and I would say that probably beginning to do work on your story, acknowledging that you have a story,
Yeah.
and then beginning to unpack that with someone who's trained to connect on that level of story is probably very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's one, feeling a desire first, and then two, recognizing you have a story, and then three, beginning to work on your story, understanding your own timeline of how the masks that you wear have been created from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And then I
So
think where
good.
we come in, Gabe, is, with Ruck the Way, we want to be a space where people can actually begin to take some literal steps with others in an environment that has been curated with this kind of thing in mind,
Yeah.
to begin to create connections and community and spaces where vulnerability can be, um, how do I want to put it? Not played at, but I mean, because it's more serious than that, but where you can sort of test the waters of vulnerability in a safe environment and
Yeah.
fun and adventure
That's right.
for
Yeah.
others.
Well, and I hope somebody listening today will sign up and come with us.
We'd
We would
love to
love to
have you
walk with
come.
you and hear your story.
That's right. And we promise not to be the gorillas who beat you up.
That's right. Well, hey, on that note, I think this has been a great conversation, Chris. Hopefully, helpful to some folks out there.
Yeah.
And as we always say, as we end, folks, let the walk.
Do the work.
All
See
right,
you next
until next
time.
time.